They will tell you kings build empires out of glory. They lie. Empires are built on the bones of the women kings claim to love. This is the story of a queen who was never enough, a servant who was never free, and a king whose obsession burned down everything he swore to protect. Before you hear another word, I need you to stay until the very end of this one, because the twist in this story will gut you. Hit that like button right now. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I know where my people are watching from. Now settle in. This is gonna hurt. The morning Celine Vale arrived at the Imperial Palace, the sky over the capital hung low and gray like a bruise that would not heal. She came through the servants' gate on the eastern wall, the one tucked behind the horse stables where the cobblestones were cracked and stained with decades of manure and rainwater. She carried one leather bag. Inside it, 2 changes of clothes, a bone comb missing 3 teeth, and a letter she had memorized so completely she could have burned it and lost nothing. The letter bore no signature, it bore no seal, but every word in it had been written by the hand of King Lucian Draven himself, and every word was a command disguised as a promise. Come to the palace. I have arranged everything. You will be safe. You will be near me. No one will know. Celine stood in the courtyard with mud on the hem of her gray dress and watched the palace rise above her like something carved from a mountain by a god with no sense of mercy. The windows were narrow. The walls were thick enough to swallow screams. And somewhere behind those walls, in a throne room she had never seen, a man she had loved since she was 17 years old was waiting for her to become invisible. She was 23. She had already learned that love, when it comes from a powerful man, is never a gift. It is a leash made of silk, and the silk only makes it harder to see the bruises. A steward named Aldrich met her at the gate. He was a thin man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that catalogued everything they touched. He looked at her bag, he looked at her shoes, he looked at the way she held her shoulders, not hunched like a servant, but straight like someone who had once expected more from the world. You are the new chambermaid, he said. It was not a question. Celine nodded. Aldrich did not smile. The Queen's private chambers are on the 3rd floor of the Western Tower. You will not speak to Her Majesty unless spoken to. You will not touch her possessions without instruction. You will not leave the tower after the 9th bell without written permission from me or the head of household. If you are found in any corridor of the eastern wing after dark, you will be dismissed. Do you understand these terms? Celine looked him in the eye. She had spent 3 years working as a healer's apprentice in a border town where soldiers came back missing hands in hope. She had held men down while their legs were sawed off. She had cleaned wounds that smelled like the end of the world. A palace steward with a list of rules did not frighten her. I understand, she said. Aldrich studied her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the Western Tower without checking to see if she followed. He did not need to. In the palace, everyone followed. The Western Tower was colder than the rest of the palace, and it was not an accident. The king's architects had designed it that way decades ago, during the reign of Lucian's father, as a way to remind whichever queen occupied it that comfort was a privilege granted by the crown, not a right owed to it. The walls were stone. The tapestries were old and thin. The fireplaces were large enough to roast an ox, but were fed barely enough wood to warm a single chair. Evelina Ashford had lived in this tower for 4 years, since the day she married Lucy Yen Draven. At the age of 19, and she had never once been warm. Celine noticed the cold the moment she stepped inside. She noticed the way the air sat heavy and damp against her skin, the way her breath did not quite form vapor, but hovered at the edge of visibility, like the tower itself was deciding whether to let her exist. She followed Aldrich up 3 flights of narrow stairs, past 2 locked doors, and a landing where a guard stood with his pike held loosely and his eyes held nowhere. The guard did not look at her. In the palace, servants were furniture that moved. Aldrich stopped at a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. A voice from inside called for them to enter. The Queen's sitting room was the only space in the Western Tower that showed any sign of a living person. There were books stacked on a table near the window, their spines cracked from use. There was a chess set made of dark and light wood, the pieces arranged mid-game against an opponent who was not present. There was a needlework frame holding a half-finished design of a bird in flight, the thread colors chosen with a precision that spoke of someone who paid attention to small things because the large things were out of her control. And there was Evelina. The Queen stood near the window with her back to the door, looking out at the courtyard below. She was tall for a woman, lean in the way of someone who forgot to eat when her mind was occupied. Her hair was dark auburn, pulled back in a simple arrangement that a more fashionable queen would have considered beneath her station. Her hands rested on the stone windowsill, and Celine could see from across the room that her knuckles were dry and cracked from the cold. She turned when she heard them enter, and Celine's first thought was that Queen Evelina Ashford had the most exhausted eyes she had ever seen. Not tired from lack of sleep, tired from the effort of pretending, day after day, that she was not slowly disappearing inside her own life. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, "this is Celine Vale. She has been assigned as your new chambermaid." Evelina looked at Celine. There was no warmth in the look, but there was no cruelty either. It was the gaze of a woman who had stopped expecting anything from the people who were sent to serve her, because the people who were sent to serve her always served someone else first. "Where was she before?" Evelina asked, and her voice was low and clear and carried the flattened vowels of the northern provinces where she had been born. "She served in a border town, Your Majesty, a healer's household." "A healer," Evelina said. She looked at Celine again, and this time something shifted behind her eyes. Not warmth, curiosity. "Can you actually heal anything?" Celine hesitated. The honest answer was complicated. She could set bones, she could stitch wounds, she could brew tinctures for fever and pain, and the kind of sadness that settled into a person's chest like winter fog. But she could not heal the thing that was broken inside herself, and she had stopped believing anyone could. "I can ease suffering, Your Majesty," Celine said. "I cannot undo what caused it." Evelina stared at her for a long beat. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, something that suggested she recognized the honesty in that answer and respected it more than she would have respected a comfortable lie. "Leave us, Aldrich," Evelina said. Aldrich hesitated. "Your Majesty, protocol requires that I brief the new—" I said, "Leave us." Aldrich's mouth thinned. He bowed and withdrew, pulling the heavy door shut behind him with a sound that echoed through the stone corridor like a judgment. Evelina crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the chess set. She did not gesture for Celine to sit. In the palace, servants stood. But she did something that surprised Celine. She looked directly at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, as if she were a person and not a piece of furniture that had been delivered. "I have had 6 chambermaids in 4 years, Evelina said. "The first 3 were spies placed by the king's council to report on my behavior. The 4th was a thief who stole a brooch my mother gave me before she died. The 5th was a kind woman who genuinely tried to help me, and she was reassigned within a month because someone decided she was becoming too loyal to me and not loyal enough to the crown. So you will forgive me, Celine Vale, if I do not immediately trust you. But I will tell you this. If you are here to watch me, I will make your job very boring. And if you are here to serve me, actually serve me, then I will treat you better than anyone in this palace has ever been treated, because I know what it feels like to be used, and I have no interest in doing it to someone else." Celine stood very still. Her heart was beating in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with shame. Because Queen Evelina Ashford, the woman whose husband had brought Celine into this palace as a hidden lover, whose marriage was the cage that kept Celine's presence a secret, was looking at her with the first honest eyes she had encountered in years. And Celine knew, in that moment, with a certainty that settled into her stomach like a stone, that she was going to betray this woman. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. Because the king had not brought her here to serve the queen. He had brought her here to be close to him. And every day she spent in this tower, earning Evelina's trust, would be another thread in a web of lies that would eventually choke them all. "I am here to serve you, Your Majesty," Celine said. It was the first lie she told in the palace. It would not be the last. The first week taught Celine the rhythms of the tower. Evelina rose early, before the sun cleared the eastern battlements, and spent the first hour of each day reading correspondence that arrived in a locked leather satchel delivered by a page who never made eye contact. She ate breakfast alone at a small table by the window, always the same meal: black bread, hard cheese, and tea brewed so strong it was nearly bitter. She did not eat lunch. She took dinner in the great hall with the king and the court, and she returned to her chambers each night looking like she had survived a war that no one else could see. Celine learned that the queen had no close friends in the palace. She learned that Evelina's ladies-in-waiting were political appointments, women from noble families who had been placed in her household not to serve her, but to serve their own family's interests. They smiled at Evelina and whispered about her the moment she left the room. They complimented her gowns and mocked her northern accent when they thought no one was listening. They brought her gifts on her naming day and forgot to ask how she was feeling on the days her hand shook from the cold and her eyes went glassy with something that was not quite tears. Celine watched all of this and said nothing. She tidied the queen's chambers. She laid out her clothes. She kept the fires burning as hot as the meager wood supply allowed. She learned which books Evelina returned to most often and made sure they were always within reach. She learned that the queen played chess against herself because no one in the palace would play against her honestly, and she began to understand that Evelina Ashford was not the passive, decorative queen the court believed her to be. She was sharp. She was observant. She was desperately, achingly alone. And she was exactly the kind of woman Celine would have chosen as a friend, in a different life, under different circumstances, in a world where Selene was not sleeping with her husband. That thought hit Celine on the fourth night, while she was banking the fire in the queen's sitting room and Evelina was reading by candlelight. It hit her like a fist to the chest, sudden and hard and breath-stealing, and she had to grip the iron poker until her knuckles went white to keep from making a sound. "Are you all right?" Evelina asked without looking up from her book. "Yes, Your Majesty." The poker slipped. Evelina turned a page. "Be careful. The ironwork in this tower is old. Everything here is old, including me some days. You are 23, Your Majesty." Evelina looked up then, and there was something in her face that Celine could not name. Surprise, maybe. Or the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who never see you clearly enough to know your age. "You remembered," Evelina said. "It was in your household records," Celine said, which was true. But the real reason she remembered was that she and Evelina were the same age, born in the same year, in the same season, on opposite ends of the empire. One of them had been raised in a northern castle and married to a king. The other had been raised in a border town and fallen in love with that same king before she knew what he was or what that love would cost her. Same age, same season, different cages. Evelina closed her book. "Sit down, Celine. Your Majesty, I did not ask you to kneel. I asked you to sit. There is a chair. Use it." Celine sat. The chair was wooden and hard and positioned across from the queen's armchair in a way that felt almost conversational, as if this room had once been designed for two people to talk as equals instead of one person to command and another to obey. Evelina studied her for a moment. "Tell me something true," she said. "Not something polite. Not something safe. Tell me one true thing about yourself that you have never told anyone in this palace." Celine's throat tightened. The truest thing she could tell Evelina was the one thing she could never say. So she chose a different truth, a smaller one, but no less real. "I am afraid of the dark," Celine said. "Not the kind of dark you get at night when the candles go out. The kind of dark that lives inside a person when they have done something they cannot take back. The kind that sits in your chest and grows a little bigger every day until you cannot remember what it felt like to breathe without it." Evelina was silent for a long time. The fire cracked and popped. Somewhere outside, a guard's boots scraped against stone. "I know that dark," Evelina said quietly. "I have lived with it since my wedding night." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Celine understood, with a clarity that made her sick, that whatever had happened between Lucien and Evelina on their wedding night had left a mark that 4 years of royal performance had not been able to cover. They sat together in the firelight without speaking for nearly an hour. It was the most honest silence Celine had experienced since arriving at the palace, and it terrified her, because it meant the queen was beginning to trust her, and trust was the one thing Celine could not afford to receive. King Lucien Draven summoned Celine to his study on the 9th night. The summons came through a sealed note delivered by a page who did not know what it contained. The note said only, "East Corridor, 2nd Landing, the door with the iron stag, 9th bell." Celine read it twice, then held it over a candle and let it burn to ash in the wash basin. She went. The eastern wing of the palace was a different world from the cold austerity of the Queen's Tower. Here the corridors were wide and lined with dark wood paneling. The tapestries were thick and new, depicting hunts and battles and the founding myths of the Draven dynasty. The air smelled of leather and smoke, and something else, something sharp and animal that Celine recognized as the particular kind of power that men like Lucien wore like cologne. She found the door with the iron stag. She did not knock. He had told her never to knock, years ago, in the border town where they had first met, when he had been a prince traveling in disguise, and she had been a healer's apprentice who did not know that the man asking her to dance at a harvest festival would one day own her life. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Lucien's study was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. Warm in a way that the Queen's Tower never was, as if the fireplaces here were fed by a different supply of wood, a richer supply, a supply that understood whose comfort mattered and whose did not. The room was large, filled with maps and books, and a heavy oak desk covered in documents bearing wax seals. There were 2 chairs by the fire, both upholstered in dark leather. One of them was occupied. King Lucien Draven was 31 years old. He was broad across the shoulders, in the way of men who had trained with swords since childhood, not the decorative musculature of a tournament fighter, but the dense, functional build of someone who understood that a body was a weapon and treated it accordingly. His hair was black and cut short against his skull, and his jaw was heavy and squared in a way that portrait painters loved and his enemies found difficult to forget. He was not handsome in the way that ballads described kings. He was handsome in the way that a wolf is handsome, all focused energy and barely contained motion, and the first time Celine had seen him, 6 years ago, she had felt something in her stomach drop, not with desire, but with the instinctive recognition that this man was dangerous, and that the danger was part of what drew her. He did not stand when she entered. He watched her cross the room from the door to the fire, and his eyes tracked her the way they had always tracked her, with an intensity that was flattering until you realized it was not affection. It was possession. "You took your time," he said. "The western tower is not close to the eastern wing." Lucien's mouth twitched. "Sit." She sat in the empty chair across from him. The leather was warm from the fire, and she hated how good it felt against her back, how her body relaxed into the comfort of it, even as her mind screamed at her to stay rigid, stay alert, stay ready. Lucien leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His hands were clasped, and she noticed a fresh cut across the knuckles of his right hand, the kind of wound that comes from hitting something hard without wrapping your fists first. "How is she?" he asked. Celine blinked. She had expected him to ask about her, about them, about the arrangement. She had not expected him to ask about Evelina. "She is lonely," Celine said. "She has an entire household, ladies in waiting, pages, servants. She has employees," Celine said. "She does not have people." Lucien was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled through his nose, a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite frustration, but lived somewhere between the two. "The marriage was necessary," he said. "The northern provinces were on the verge of revolt. Her father controlled the border garrisons. Marrying her stabilized the region and prevented a war that would have killed thousands. I did not marry her to make her happy. I married her to save the empire." "And you brought me here to make yourself happy," Celine said. Lucien looked at her. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black in the firelight, and they held an expression she had seen 100 times before, an expression that combined desire and need, and something raw, something that looked almost like pain. "I brought you here because I could not breathe without you," he said. "I spent 3 years trying. I governed provinces and commanded armies and signed treaties and attended every miserable banquet and council meeting. This empire demanded of me, and every single night I lay awake thinking about you in that border town, wondering if you were safe, wondering if someone else was touching you, wondering if you had forgotten me. And I decided I would rather burn this palace to the ground than spend 1 more year pretending you do not exist." Celine closed her eyes. This was the Lucien she remembered. Not the king, not the strategist. The man underneath. The one who loved with the ferocity of someone who had been taught that power means never having to lose anything, and who could not understand that some things are lost the moment you try to own them. "You put me in her household," Celine said. She opened her eyes. "You put me in the household of the woman you married. The woman who sleeps alone in a cold tower while you sit in a warm study. The woman who has no friends and no allies and no one she can trust. And you made me her maid, so that I would be close to you, so that you could summon me through the corridors like a dog." "Celine, do you know what she said to me on my first night? She said she would treat me better than anyone in this palace has ever been treated. She said she knows what it feels like to be used. And I sat there, Lucien, I sat there and looked into the eyes of the woman whose husband I have been." She stopped. Her jaw clenched. She could feel the heat rising in her face, and she pressed her palms flat against the arms of the chair to steady herself. Lucien watched her. He did not reach for her. He had learned years ago that touching Celine when she was angry was like grabbing a hot blade. You would get burned and she would cut you. I know what I have done, he said. His voice was low. I know what I am asking of you. I know it is cruel, and I know it is selfish, and I know that a better man would have let you go. But I am not a better man, Celine. I am the man I am. And the man I am would destroy himself before he would give you up. That is not love, Celine said. That is hunger. Lucien's jaw tightened. Call it what you want. They sat in silence. The fire burned. The shadows moved across the walls. And Celine felt the dark inside her chest grow a little larger, a little denser, a little more familiar. She stayed for an hour. They did not touch. They barely spoke. She sat in his chair by his fire in his warm room and listened to the palace breathe around them. And when the 11th bell rang, she stood and walked out without looking back. She returned to the western tower. She climbed the stairs. She entered the queen's antechamber, where a small cot had been set up for her beside the linen closet, and she lay down on it and stared at the stone ceiling and listened to the sound of Evelina sleeping in the next room. Two people in this palace needed her. One of them needed her body and her presence and the weight of her beside him in the dark. The other needed her honesty and her companionship and the simple, devastating fact that she listened. She could not give both of them what they needed. She could not even give herself what she needed, because what she needed was to run, to leave, to vanish into the borderlands where no one knew her name or her history or the particular texture of her shame. But she did not run. She lay on her cot in the cold and listened to the queen breathe and let the dark inside her grow. 3 weeks passed. In 3 weeks, Celine became indispensable to the queen in ways that neither of them expected. It began with small things. Celine brewed a tincture for Evelina's cracked hands, a recipe she had learned from the healer in the border town, made from rendered tallow and chamomile and a trace of something bitter that she would not name. Evelina's hands healed within days. Then Celine noticed that the queen slept poorly, not from nightmares but from the cold that seeped through the stone walls after midnight, and she began heating stones in the fireplace and wrapping them in cloth and placing them in Evelina's bed before she retired. Then she noticed that Evelina ate almost nothing at dinner because the great hall made her anxious, and she began keeping bread and dried fruit in the sitting room so the queen could eat in private, without an audience, without the weight of 100 noble eyes measuring every bite she took. Each kindness was genuine. That was the part that destroyed Celine. She was not performing care for the queen as part of some calculated strategy. She was caring for Evelina because Evelina needed care, and because Celine was, at her core, a healer, and healers cannot watch someone suffer without reaching out. The guilt came later, always later, in the dark hours when she lay on her cot and cataloged the lies she was building, brick by careful brick. You are different from the others, Evelina said one evening. They were in the sitting room. Evelina was working at her needlework. Celine was organizing the queen's correspondence into the locked satchel for collection. Celine did not look up. Different how, Your Majesty? You do not gossip. You do not flinch when I raise my voice. You do not look at me like I am a problem to be managed. Celine set the satchel aside. You are not a problem, Your Majesty. Evelina's needle paused. To this court, I am nothing but a problem. I am the northern wife the king married for politics. I am the woman who has not yet produced an heir. I am the obstacle between every ambitious duke and his access to the throne. Do you know what Lord Harkin said about me at last week's council reception? He said I was a decorative bridge between two provinces, and that bridges are only valued until someone builds a road. Lord Harkin sounds like a man who has never been punched in the mouth, Celine said. Evelina looked at her. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it transformed her face from the careful mask she wore in public into something younger and wilder and startlingly beautiful. Celine stared. She had not expected the laugh. She had not expected the beauty, and she had not expected the sharp, painful twist in her chest that came with realizing that Evelina Ashford, in a different world, in a fair world, would have been someone extraordinary, and that this palace, this marriage, this arrangement was killing her by inches. I would very much like to see Lord Harkin punched in the mouth, Evelina said. She was still smiling. Would you arrange that for me, Celine? I will add it to my duties, Your Majesty. Evelina shook her head, the smile fading to something softer. Call me Evelina. When we are alone. Please. That is not appropriate, Your Majesty. Nothing in this palace is appropriate. Call me Evelina. Celine swallowed. The dark in her chest pulsed. Evelina, she said. The queen nodded once, satisfied, and returned to her needlework. And Celine stood in the middle of the sitting room and felt the ground beneath her shift, because a queen had just offered her a name. And a name, in a palace full of titles and deceptions, was the most dangerous thing anyone could give. Lucien summoned her again the following week. Same note, same corridor, same door with the iron stag. But this time, when Celine entered the study, he was not sitting. He was standing by the window with a glass of something dark in his hand and a look on his face that she recognized from the worst nights in the border town. The nights when the soldiers came back broken and the healer could not fix them, and the only thing left to do was drink. "Someone has been talking," Lucien said. He did not turn from the window. Celine closed the door behind her. "Talking about what?" "About you. About my interest in you. Lord Voss mentioned to his wife that I personally approved your assignment to the Queen's household, and his wife mentioned it to Lady Alden. And Lady Alden mentioned it to her sister, who happens to be married to Duke Edmund Crestfall. And Duke Crestfall is the most ambitious and the most ruthless man in this court. And now he is asking questions about why the king would take a personal interest in the hiring of a chambermaid." Celine leaned against the door. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her voice level. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that lead to answers I cannot afford." Lucien turned from the window. His face was tight. "I have managed this empire through 6 border conflicts, 2 assassination attempts, and a famine that killed 12,000 people. I have never lost control of a situation. But I cannot control what people whisper, and whispers in this palace are more dangerous than swords." "Then send me away," Celine said. Lucien's eyes snapped to hers. "No. Lucien, no. I brought you here. I will protect you. I will protect this. No one will touch you. No one will question you. I will make sure of it. And how exactly will you do that without confirming every suspicion Crestfall already has?" Lucien set his glass down on the windowsill hard enough that Celine heard the base crack against the stone. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood in front of her, close enough that she could smell the liquor on his breath, and the leather of his coat, and the particular scent of his skin that she had once loved and now feared because it reminded her of everything she had lost. "I will handle Crestfall," he said. His voice was quiet and deadly. "I will handle the whispers. I will handle the court. All I need you to do is stay. Stay in the palace. Stay near her. Stay near me." Celine looked up at him. His face was inches from hers, and his eyes were burning with that intensity she knew too well. The intensity that made her feel like the only person alive, and the intensity that made her feel like prey. "You're asking me to lie to a woman who trusts me," Celine said, "every single day. You're asking me to look into her eyes and pretend that I am her friend while I'm sneaking through corridors to see her husband. You're asking me to carry that weight and smile while I do it." "Yes," Lucien said. "That is exactly what I'm asking. And what happens when the weight crushes me?" Lucien raised his hand and touched her face. His fingers were rough with calluses from years of sword work, and his touch was gentle in a way that contradicted everything else about him, and that contradiction was the thing that had hooked Celine 6 years ago and never let go. "I will not let it crush you," he said. It was a promise he could not keep. They both knew it. But the warmth of his hand on her skin and the fire behind her, and the loneliness that had eaten through her bones for 3 years, made her weak in a way she despised, and when he kissed her, she did not pull away. She kissed him back. She hated herself for it, and afterward, walking back through the dark corridors to the western tower, she pressed her hand against the cold stone wall and felt the palace pulse around her like a living thing, indifferent and enormous, and she understood that this place would not let her go. Not because the doors were locked, but because the people inside it needed her in ways that had wrapped around her like chains, and chains do not care whether you consented to wearing them. She entered the antechamber. She lay on her cot. She stared at the ceiling. In the next room, Evelina slept. And somewhere in the eastern wing, Lucien Draven sat alone in his warm study and poured himself another glass and stared at the fire, and told himself that what he was doing was love, because the alternative was admitting that what he was doing was the cruelest thing one human being can do to 2 others. The next morning, Celine woke to find Evelina standing in the doorway of the antechamber, watching her. "You were talking in your sleep," Evelina said. Her arms were crossed over her nightgown and her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked, in the gray morning light, like someone who had just discovered a crack in a wall she thought was solid. Celine sat up. Her mouth was dry. "What did I say? You said the word sorry, over and over, like a prayer." Celine's blood went cold. She forced herself to breathe. "I have bad dreams sometimes," she said. "It means nothing." Evelina studied her. Then she uncrossed her arms and said, "Come, have breakfast with me. The bread is stale, but the tea is decent, and I'm tired of eating alone." It was not a command. It was an invitation, and it was worse than any command could have been, because it was kind, and kindness from Evelina Ashford felt like a knife pressed against the softest part of Celine's throat. They ate together by the window. The sky was gray again. The courtyard below was filling with servants and soldiers beginning their days. Evelina tore the bread into pieces and dunked them in her tea and talked about a book she had been reading, a history of the northern campaigns written by a general who had served under her grandfather. And Celine listened and nodded and asked questions that made Evelina's eyes light up with the particular pleasure of someone who has finally found a person willing to engage with the things she cares about. And under the table, Celine's hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from the knowledge that in every palace corridor, whispers were already spreading, that Duke Crestfall was already asking questions, that the silk leash around her throat was tightening with every passing day, and that the woman sitting across from her, breaking bread and sharing tea and offering trust like a gift she could not afford to give, had no idea that the maid she was beginning to love like a sister was the same woman who had kissed her husband in the firelight less than 8 hours ago. The dark in Celine's chest grew, and somewhere in the palace a door was opening that no one would be able to close. By the end of the 4th week, Duke Edmund Crestfall had assembled enough fragments to construct a theory, and theories in the hands of ambitious men are more dangerous than loaded crossbows. He was 52, silver-haired, built like a former soldier who had traded muscle for influence and found the exchange profitable. His estates controlled the southern grain supply. His allies held 4 of the 12 council seats. And his hatred of Lucien Draven was not political. It was personal. Lucien's father had executed Crestfall's brother 20 years ago for treason that may or may not have been real, and Crestfall had spent 2 decades smiling at the Draven dynasty while sharpening a blade behind his back. He did not yet have proof. But he had a pattern, a chambermaid assigned by royal order, a king who had rejected 3 candidates from noble households before accepting a commoner with no court experience, a servant who moved through the palace with a confidence that did not match her station, and most damning of all, a report from a guard who had noticed the same servant leaving the eastern wing after the 11th bell on 2 separate occasions. Crestfall sat in his private quarters and turned these fragments over in his mind like a man polishing stones. And he smiled because he understood something that Lucien Draven had apparently forgotten. In the game of empires, the most powerful weapon is not a sword or an army. It is a secret. And secrets, once exposed at the right moment, in front of the right audience, can topple thrones. The winter banquet was 6 weeks away. The entire court would be present. Every noble house, every foreign ambassador, every influential merchant and military commander in the empire. 6 weeks was more than enough time to gather what he needed. He called for his steward and began to plan. And in the western tower, Cellini sat beside Evelina and read aloud from a book of northern folk tales while the queen rested her head against the back of her chair and closed her eyes. And for a few stolen minutes, the only sound in the room was Celine's voice and the crackle of the fire. And both women, for entirely different reasons, wished that the moment would never end. But moments end. They always end. And the door that had opened in the palace was swinging wider now, letting in a cold wind that smelled like scandal and blood, and neither the queen nor the king nor the woman trapped between them could see what was coming. Not yet, but they would. 6 weeks before the winter banquet, the palace changed. It did not change the way storms change a landscape, sudden and visible and impossible to ignore. It changed the way rot changes wood, from the inside out, so slowly that by the time you notice the damage, the structure is already compromised. Celine felt it first. She felt it in the way the guards at the western tower looked at her a half-second longer than they used to. She felt it in the way Aldrich the steward began appearing at odd hours near the queen's chambers, always with a reason, always checking linens or verifying supply deliveries, but always with his hatchet face tilted slightly towards Celine as if he were measuring something he could not yet name. She felt it in the corridors at night, when the shadows seemed thicker and the silence seemed louder, and the palace itself seemed to be holding its breath. And she felt it in the way Lucien looked at her the next time he summoned her to the study. He was standing behind his desk this time, not sitting, not drinking. His hands were flat on the oak surface and his shoulders were drawn up like a man bracing for impact. He did not greet her when she entered. He did not tell her to sit. "Crestfall has a spy in my household," Lucien said. Celine stopped 3 steps inside the door. Which household? Yours or Evelina's? Mine. A page. A boy named Ridley. 14 years old. I caught him copying the schedule of my private meetings, including the dates and times you were seen entering this wing. How much does Crestfall have? Enough to speculate. Not enough to prove. But he is not the kind of man who waits for proof. He is the kind who builds a story from fragments and tells it so well that the truth becomes irrelevant. Celine's mouth went dry. She leaned against the door frame because her legs felt uncertain beneath her. What did you do with the boy? I reassigned him to the kitchens. If I dismissed him outright, Crestfall would know I found his source, and he would simply place another one. This way, the boy reports that he was moved for incompetence, and Crestfall loses his eyes inside my wing without understanding why. Celine looked at him. The firelight carved his face into angles and hollows, and she thought, not for the first time, that Lucien Draven operated the way a predator operates, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always calculating the angle of attack and the cost of retreat, always treating people as pieces on a board. It had been thrilling once. Now it made her stomach turn. You are playing a game with a 14-year-old boy's life, Celine said. I am protecting us. You are protecting yourself. There is a difference. Lucien's hands pressed harder against the desk. His knuckles whitened. She watched the tendons in his forearms shift under the skin and recognized the tension for what it was. The physical manifestation of a man who was not accustomed to being challenged and who processed the discomfort of it through his body because his mind refused to acknowledge it. Everything I do, Lucien said, and his voice was low and controlled in the way that meant he was furious. Every decision I make, every risk I take, is to keep you here, close to me, safe. If you cannot see that, what I see is a king who hid his lover inside his wife's household and then acted surprised when the walls started listening. Lucien straightened. His jaw clenched, and she watched the muscle above his ear jump once, twice. He came around the desk and walked toward her, not fast, not slow, with the deliberate measured stride of a man who understood that movement itself was a form of communication, and that the way you crossed a room told the other person everything they needed to know about whether you intended to comfort them or corner them. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, not close enough to touch. I will not apologize for wanting you, he said. I will not apologize for building a world in which I get to see you every day. You can call it obsession, you can call it hunger, you can call it whatever word makes you feel like you are the reasonable one in this room. But I watched my father rule this empire alone for 30 years, and it hollowed him out from the inside until there was nothing left but title and bone. I swore I would never become that. And you are the only thing standing between me and that emptiness. So yes, I brought you here, and yes, I would do it again. And I will keep you here because the alternative is a version of myself I cannot survive. Celine listened. She heard every word. She understood every word. And she recognized with the particular clarity that comes from loving someone for 6 years and watching them fail to grow, that Lucien did not love her the way a man loves a woman. He loved her the way a drowning man loves air, desperately, violently, without any regard for whether the air itself had lungs of its own. She reached up and placed her hand flat against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat through the fabric, hard and fast, and she held it there for 3 seconds and then pushed. Not hard. Just enough to create distance. Just enough to remind him that she was not furniture and not a concept and not a cure for whatever was broken inside him. You need to stop summoning me to this wing, she said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her everything to keep it that way. If Crestfall is watching, every visit is another thread he can pull. I will not come here again unless there is no other choice. Celine, I mean it, Lucien. No more sealed notes, no more pages, no more doors with iron stags. If you need to speak to me, find another way. A way that does not light a trail straight to us. Lucien stared at her. She watched something move behind his eyes, something that looked like loss. And for a brief moment she saw the man underneath the king. The man who had danced with her at a harvest festival in a border town and laughed at her jokes and held her hand while they walked through fields of winter wheat that came up to their hips. That man was still in there, buried under layers of crown and strategy and the particular kind of damage that power inflicts on people who hold it too long. But she could not save that man. She had tried for 6 years and it had cost her everything, and the man was still drowning, and the only thing that had changed was that now she was drowning with him. She left without kissing him. She walked back through the eastern corridor, with her hands at her sides and her chin up and her breathing controlled. And when she reached the stairwell that connected the wings, she stopped and pressed her forehead against the cold stone and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of something that was not crying but was adjacent to it, a shaking in her chest that rose up through her throat and died before it reached her eyes. Then she straightened. She smoothed her dress. She climbed the stairs to the western tower, and she went back to work. The following morning, Evelina asked Celine to accompany her to the palace gardens. This was unusual. The queen rarely left the western tower during the day, preferring the safety of her sitting room to the open corridors where she was subject to the stares and whispered commentary of every noble who happened to pass. But the weather had broken overnight, the gray sky splitting open to reveal a thin, fragile blue, and Evelina said she needed air. She said it the way a prisoner says it, not as a preference but as a biological necessity, as if one more day inside those stone walls would finish whatever the cold had started. They walked through the lower courtyard and into the walled garden on the southern side of the palace. The garden was old, planted 3 generations ago by a queen whose name Celine had not learned, and it had the overgrown, slightly wild look of a place that was maintained by obligation rather than love. The hedges were trimmed but shapeless. The paths were gravel that had not been raked in weeks. The flower beds were empty and dark, and waiting for spring with the patient endurance of things that have no choice. Evelina walked slowly. She kept her hands clasped in front of her, and Celine noticed that she was wearing the thinnest pair of gloves she owned, the ones that offered almost no protection against the cold, as if she had chosen discomfort deliberately, as if feeling the bite of the air against her skin was preferable to feeling nothing at all. "I have been thinking about what you said," Evelina told her, "about the dark that lives inside a person, the kind that grows." Celine's step faltered. She recovered quickly but not quickly enough. She felt Evelina glance at her. "I know that dark well," Evelina continued. "I have carried it since my father told me I would marry the king. I was 17. I had never met Lucienne. I had never been outside the northern provinces. My father called me into his study and told me I was to be the bridge between our house and the crown. And when I asked him what would happen to the life I had planned for myself, he said there was no life outside the one the empire required of me. He said that survival and surrender are sometimes the same thing." Celine walked beside her and said nothing. She felt the story pulling at her like a current, drawing her closer to Evelina, and she recognized the pull for what it was. The dangerous gravitational force of 2 people who should never have been placed this close to each other because their damage was compatible in a way that made connection inevitable. Evelina stopped beside a stone bench near the garden wall. She sat. Celine remained standing, as protocol demanded, but Evelina patted the bench beside her with an impatient gesture that said, "Protocol could go to the nearest ditch and drown." Celine sat. "I will tell you something I have never told anyone in this palace," Evelina said. Her voice was quiet. Her eyes were fixed on the empty flower beds. "On my wedding night, Lucien was courteous. He was respectful. He did not force himself on me, and I want to be clear about that because the rumors suggest otherwise and the rumors are wrong. But when I looked into his eyes that night, I saw something that frightened me more than violence ever could. I saw absence. He was there in the room with me, but he was not present. His mind was somewhere else. His heart was somewhere else. And I realized, in the first hour of my marriage, that I had been given a husband who had already given himself to someone else." Celine stopped breathing. "I do not know who she is," Evelina said. "I have never known. He has never mentioned her name, and I have never found evidence. But I know she exists the way you know the sun exists on a cloudy day. You cannot see it, but you can feel its pull on everything around you. Every time he looks past me at dinner. Every time he is distracted during council. Every time he comes to my chambers out of duty and leaves them with relief. She is there. She has always been there." The gravel path blurred in front of Celine's eyes. She blinked until it cleared. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was gripping her own fingers so tightly that the knuckles had gone bloodless and white. "Does it make you angry?" Celine managed. Evelina considered the question. "No," she said. "Anger requires surprise. I was never surprised. I was disappointed, which is different. Anger is a fire. Disappointment is a flood. It does not burn. It rises slowly and fills every room, and eventually you learn to breathe underwater because the alternative is not breathing at all." Celine turned her head and looked at the queen. Evelina's profile was sharp against the winter sky, her jaw set, her eyes dry, and Celine thought that this woman was the strongest person she had ever met, and that she, Celine, was the worst person she had ever been. Because the woman Evelina had sensed on her wedding night, the invisible presence that had stolen her husband's attention and affection, the ghost that had haunted her marriage for 4 years, was sitting beside her on this bench, holding her own fingers until they were numb, fighting the urge to confess everything, and knowing that confession would not heal anything, but would simply transfer the pain from one chest to another.
"You deserve better than this," Celine said. Evelina smiled. It was a sad smile, the kind that has given up on changing anything and has settled instead for acknowledging the shape of the damage. "Perhaps," she said, "but deserve has nothing to do with what we get. Deserve is a word for children who still believe the world keeps score."
They sat in the garden until the thin blue sky closed over again and the gray returned and the cold drove them back inside. They did not speak again about Lucien or the unknown woman or the loneliness of a marriage built on politics instead of love. But something had shifted between them. Some wall had come down or some door had opened, and when they returned to the western tower, Evelina took Celine's hand and held it for a moment. A brief firm pressure that communicated more than 1,000 words could have, and Celine held the queen's hand and felt something inside her crack, like ice on a river in early spring. She was falling in love with this woman, not the way she loved Lucien, not with heat and hunger and the desperate need to be consumed. She was falling in love with Evelina the way you fall in love with someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. The way you fall in love with someone whose pain mirrors your own, the way you fall in love with someone you are actively destroying and cannot stop. It was the worst kind of love, the kind that comes with a built-in ending. And the ending was getting closer every day. Duke Crestfall moved carefully. He was not a man who rushed. He had waited 20 years for his moment, and 20 years of patience had taught him the value of precision over speed. He did not confront the king. He did not spread rumors himself. He was far too intelligent for that. Instead, he planted seeds. A question here. A raised eyebrow there. A casual observation at a council dinner about how unusual it was for a king to personally approve the assignment of a chambermaid. A quiet conversation with Lord Harkin about the peculiar loyalty the crown seemed to show toward a commoner with no family connections and no political value. Harkin, who was vain and easily manipulated, took the bait. He began watching Celine. He noted when she appeared in the corridors outside the Queen's Tower. He noted when she was absent. He compiled a rough timeline that, while incomplete, showed gaps in her schedule that could not be explained by her duties as a chambermaid. He brought this timeline to Crestfall over wine one evening, and Crestfall studied it with the careful attention of a man reading a map to buried treasure. "She disappears for an hour or more after the 9th bell," Harkin said, 2 or 3 times a week. The Western Tower servants do not account for her during those periods. Crestfall folded the timeline and placed it inside his coat. "And where does she go during these absences?" "I do not know. My informants lose her in the eastern corridors." Crestfall's mouth curved. The eastern corridors, where the king's private study is located. Harkin's eyes widened as the implication settled into him. "You cannot be suggesting—" "I am not suggesting anything," Crestfall said. "I am observing a pattern. Patterns are facts. What people choose to do with facts is their own business." He poured more wine for Harkin and changed the subject to grain tariffs. And Harkin, who thought himself a player in this game, did not realize that he had just become a piece in someone else's. Crestfall needed one more element. He needed a witness, not a servant or a guard whose word could be dismissed as gossip, but someone with standing, someone whose testimony at a public gathering would carry the weight of credibility. He spent 3 weeks identifying his candidate, and when he found her, he smiled the way a hunter smiles when the deer steps into the clearing. Lady Marin Ashworth, 38. Widow of a general who had died in the Eastern campaigns, well-respected, well-connected, and deeply, bitterly resentful of the crown because her petition for a military pension had been denied by the King's Council 6 months ago, leaving her dependent on the charity of relatives who enjoyed reminding her of their generosity. Crestfall invited her to dine at his estate outside the capital. He was solicitous. He was sympathetic. He listened to her grievances about the pension with the appearance of genuine outrage and promised to raise the matter at the next council session. And then, over dessert, he mentioned casually that he had heard disturbing rumors about the king's conduct, rumors that, if true, would suggest the crown was rotten in ways that went beyond mere financial negligence. "What kind of rumors?" Lady Ashworth asked. "The kind involving a young woman in the Queen's household who may be serving a purpose that has nothing to do with chamber duties." Lady Ashworth set down her spoon.
She was not a fool. She understood immediately what Crestfall was building, and she understood that he was offering her a role in it. The question was whether the role came with a price, and whether the price was worth paying. "What would you need from me?" she asked. "Only your eyes," Crestfall said, "and your willingness to tell the court what they see." He did not mention the word testimony. He did not mention the winter banquet. He did not need to. Lady Ashworth had survived the death of a husband and the betrayal of a government and the slow humiliation of poverty, and she understood leverage the way soldiers understand terrain. She knew what Crestfall was offering and what he would expect in return, and she made her calculation in the time it took to lift her wine glass. "Tell me where to look," she said. Crestfall told her, and the trap began to close. Celine knew something was wrong 3 days before it happened. She could not identify the specific evidence because there was none. No confrontation, no accusation, no sealed note bearing bad news. It was subtler than that. It was the way the air in the palace felt tighter, as if the walls were contracting. It was the way certain nobles looked at her when she passed through the corridors, not with suspicion, but with something worse, with anticipation, the way an audience looks at a stage before the curtain rises. She tried to warn Lucien. She found a way to pass him a message through a kitchen servant she trusted, a woman named Dalla who had worked in the border town and owed Celine a debt that neither of them discussed. The message was simple. "Something is moving. Be careful." Lucien's response came back the same day, equally simple. "I know. Stay close to the Queen. Stay close to the Queen." As if Celine had any other choice. As if the tangled web of loyalty and deception and genuine affection that bound her to Evelina could be reduced to a strategic instruction from a man who still believed he was the one controlling the board. But Celine stayed close. She stayed close because Evelina needed her, and because she needed Evelina, and because the palace was tightening around all of them, and the only thing she could do was keep the Queen safe and pray to whatever forces governed the universe that the storm would pass without destroying everything she had built. It did not pass. Lady Ashworth came to the Western Tower on a Tuesday. She arrived under the pretense of delivering a gift to the Queen, a small embroidered cushion that she claimed had been made by the women of her late husband's regiment. Evelina received her in the sitting room with the careful politeness she showed all visitors, the mask firmly in place, the northern accent smoothed away, the exhaustion hidden behind a composure so practiced it looked effortless. Celine stood by the door and watched Lady Ashworth the way a fox watches a fence line, looking for the trap. Lady Ashworth was good. She was warm. She was gracious. She complimented the Queen's needlework and asked about her reading, and mentioned that she had heard Evelina was interested in the history of the northern campaigns, and would Her Majesty like to borrow a volume from her late husband's personal library. Evelina softened. She did not often receive visitors who showed genuine interest in her mind rather than her title, and Lady Ashworth's attention was skilled enough to pass for sincere. They talked for an hour. Celine served tea and stood quietly and noticed two things. First, Lady Ashworth was watching the Queen with an attention that went beyond courtesy. She was studying Evelina, cataloging her mannerisms, her speech patterns, the way she interacted with Celine. Second, and more alarming, Lady Ashworth was watching Celine, not overtly, not in a way that Evelina would notice, but Celine, who had spent years reading the bodies of soldiers and patients who were hiding their pain, recognized surveillance when she saw it. After Lady Ashworth left, Evelina sat in her chair and smiled in a way Celine had rarely seen. "She was lovely," Evelina said. "It has been so long since someone came here to talk to me rather than at me." Celine picked up the tea things. Her hands were not shaking. She would not allow them to shake. "She was lovely," Celine agreed. She did not say the rest of what she was thinking, which was that lovely people with carefully timed visits and two perfect questions did not arrive at the Queen's chambers by accident, and that Lady Ashworth's eyes had been doing the work of someone else's agenda. That night, Celine did not sleep. She lay on her cot and counted the stones in the ceiling and listened to Evelina breathe and built a map in her mind of every person who might want to hurt the woman in the next room. The map was larger than she wanted it to be. It included nobles she had seen in the corridors, servants who reported to Aldrich, council members whose names she had overheard Evelina mention in frustration. And at the center of the map, the name she had been hearing more and more frequently in the whispered conversations that died whenever she entered a room, Crestfall. She did not know what he was planning, but she knew the shape of it the way sailors know the shape of a storm before it breaks, by the color of the sky and the weight of the air and the particular silence that falls over the world when something massive and destructive is gathering just beyond the horizon.
2 weeks before the banquet, Evelina asked Celine to help her choose a gown. This was not vanity, it was armor. Evelina understood with the strategic intelligence that the court consistently underestimated, that the winter banquet was the most dangerous night of the year. Every noble house would be represented, every alliance would be tested, every weakness would be probed, and the queen of the empire could not afford to look anything less than unassailable. They spent an afternoon in the dressing chamber, a room attached to Evelina's bedroom that was small and cold and lined with closets containing gowns that had been chosen for the queen by the royal tailor without consulting her preferences. The gowns were beautiful in the way that cages are beautiful, designed to showcase the jewel inside them, rather than to make the jewel comfortable. This one, Evelina said, pulling out a dark blue gown with silver embroidery along the bodice. It was the color of a winter sky just before nightfall, deep and cold and arresting. Celine looked at it. "It is striking," she said. "It is frightening," Evelina corrected. "That is the point. I do not want to look beautiful at the banquet, Celine. I want to look like a woman who cannot be dismissed. There is a difference." Celine helped her try it on. She laced the bodice and adjusted the shoulders and pinned the train, and her fingers brushed against Evelina's skin at the back of her neck, and both of them went very still for a moment, a held breath that had nothing to do with the fitting and everything to do with the fact that touch, between these two women, had become something charged and complicated and impossible to discuss. "How do I look?" Evelina asked. She was facing the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her with the dark blue gown and the auburn hair and the eyes that were no longer exhausted, but alert and fierce and ready. "You look like a queen," Celine said. "Good," Evelina said, "because I have spent 4 years in this palace looking like a guest. I think it is time I reminded them who lives here." There was something in her voice that Celine had not heard before. It was not anger. It was not desperation. It was resolution. The quiet, immovable resolution of a woman who has reached the bottom of her endurance and discovered, to her surprise, that the bottom is solid ground, and that solid ground is something you can push off from. Celine watched Evelina study her own reflection and felt two things at once. The first was pride, fierce and unexpected. Pride in this woman who had been underestimated and neglected and isolated, and who was now, in the fitting of a gown in a cold dressing room, quietly deciding to become someone the court could not ignore. The second was terror, because a queen who steps into her power is a queen who sees everything. And a queen who sees everything will eventually see the truth about the woman standing behind her, lacing her dress, hiding secrets in every fingertip. 2 days before the banquet, Celine made a decision. She found Dalla in the kitchens during the afternoon shift change when the noise and activity provided cover. She pulled the older woman into the pantry and closed the door and spoke quickly and without preamble. "I need you to carry a message to the king's study. Not to the king, to the desk. There is a drawer on the left side that does not lock properly. I need you to place a folded paper inside that drawer and leave without being seen." Dalla looked at her with the hard, flat eyes of a woman who had survived the borderlands and did not waste time on moral deliberation when action was required. "What does the paper say?" "It says, 'They are coming for me, and they will use me to come for her. If you have ever meant a single word you said to me, you will find a way to end this before the banquet. Let me go." Dalla took the paper. She did not ask who she was, or who her was, or what this was. She folded it into her apron and left the pantry, and 12 hours later Celine received a response, not on paper, but in person. Lucien appeared at the door of the Queen's antechamber at 3 in the morning. Celine woke to the sound of the latch lifting and rolled off her cot with her hand already reaching for the small knife she kept under the thin pillow, a habit from the borderlands that she had never broken. She saw his silhouette in the doorway, and her blood froze because he had never come to the Western Tower before. Never. This was the one boundary he had maintained, and his presence here meant that the situation had moved beyond his ability to control it at a distance. "Are you insane?" she whispered. "The queen is sleeping in the next room." "I know," Lucien said. His voice was barely audible. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him and stood in the dark with his back against the wood, and she could hear his breathing, and it was wrong. It was too fast. The breathing of a man whose body was processing a level of fear that his face would never show. "I cannot let you go," he said. "Lucien, I cannot." "Crestfall has assembled a case. I do not know the details, but I know the shape of it. He intends to present evidence at the banquet that will implicate you as my mistress and me as an unfaithful husband and Evelina as a fool. If I send you away now, before the banquet, it confirms everything. It tells the court that I had something to hide and that I chose to hide it rather than face it. And if I stay, Celine said, it gives him a target. If you stay, I can control the narrative. I can position you as a loyal servant whom the queen herself values. I can make Crestfall's accusations look like a political attack rather than an exposure of truth. Celine stared at him in the dark. She could not see his face, but she could hear the machinery of his mind working, the gears and levers of strategy turning over each other, and she felt something inside her go cold. Not angry, not sad. Cold. The temperature of a woman who has realized that the man she loves will always, always choose the game over the people inside it. You want me to stand in that banquet hall, she said, and let Crestfall point his finger at me, and bet everything on your ability to talk your way out of it. I want you to trust me, the way Evelina trusts me. Celine's voice was flat. The way she trusts me while I lie to her every day. That kind of trust. Lucienne was silent. In the next room, Evelina shifted in her sleep. The sound of it, the rustle of sheets, the soft unconscious murmur of a woman who did not know that her husband was standing 10 feet away in the dark, having a whispered argument with his hidden lover about how best to survive the lie they had built around her, that sound went through Celine like a blade. Get out, Celine said. Get out of this tower. Get out of her space. You do not belong here. Celine. Now. She heard him exhale. She heard his hand find the door latch. She heard the door open and close and his footsteps fade down the corridor. And then there was silence. The silence of a palace at 3 a.m, the silence of a woman lying on a cot in the dark, knowing that in 48 hours everything she has tried to hold together will come apart, and that the only question left is who will be standing when the dust settles. In the next room, Evelina breathed. In the eastern wing, Lucien paced. In his estate beyond the city walls, Duke Crestfall slept well for the first time in 20 years. And the winter banquet, the night that would burn through every lie and leave nothing but ash and exposed bone, was 2 days away. The invitations had been sent. The hall had been prepared. The candles had been counted, and the wine had been decanted, and the long tables had been set with silver and crystal, and the blind indifference of a palace that did not care what was about to happen inside its walls. Celine lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the last thread of her old life. The life where she could pretend this was manageable, where she could serve the queen and visit the king and carry the dark in her chest without it consuming her. She felt that last thread stretch and thin and begin to fray. And in the cold pre-dawn silence, while the palace slept and the empire breathed and the banquet loomed like an execution, she heard Evelina's voice from the next room. Not asleep, awake. Celine, are you there? Celine closed her eyes. I am here, she said. A pause. Then Evelina's voice, quiet and raw and stripped of every layer of royal composure. I'm afraid of the banquet. I have never said that out loud before. I'm afraid of what they will do. I'm afraid of what they will say. I'm afraid that I will stand in that hall and look around and realize that there is not a single person in the room who is on my side. Celine pressed her fist against her sternum, against the dark that lived there, and said the truest thing she had said in weeks. I am on your side, Evelina. Silence. Then, from the next room, a sound that might have been a breath, or might have been a sob, or might have been the sound of a woman deciding to believe something she could not afford to believe. Then Evelina said, I know. And the night swallowed them both. The morning of the winter banquet, Celine woke before dawn and dressed in the dark, and walked to the window of the antechamber and looked out at the capital below. The city was still sleeping. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray lines. The streets were empty except for a cart moving slowly toward the market district, its wheels grinding against the cobblestones with a sound like bones being crushed. She stood at that window and made a decision. She could not stop what was coming. She could not undo the lies she had told, or the love she had broken, or the trust she had stolen. She could not turn back time and refuse Lucien's letter, or refuse to walk through the servants' gate, or refuse to sit in the queen's chair and accept the queen's name and the queen's friendship and the queen's heart. But she could choose what happened next, not the outcome. The outcome was out of her hands. But the choice of who she would be when the walls came down and the fire reached the room where she stood. She turned from the window. She crossed the antechamber. She opened the door to the queen's bedroom and stood in the doorway and looked at Evelina, who was lying on her side with her eyes open, staring at the wall, already awake, already bracing herself for the night ahead. Whatever happens tonight, Celine said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised her because nothing inside her was steady. Nothing inside her had been steady for weeks. I want you to know that every moment I have spent in this tower with you has been the most honest part of my life. Evelina sat up slowly. Her hair was loose and her eyes were searching, and she looked at Celine with an expression that was not quite trust and not quite suspicion, but something in between, something that recognized that the woman in the doorway was telling a truth that was wrapped around a larger, heavier truth that had not yet been spoken. "Why does that sound like a goodbye?" Evelina asked. Celine did not answer. She held the queen's gaze for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then she turned and walked back to the antechamber and closed the door and pressed her back against it and slid down to the floor and sat there with her knees drawn up and her forehead pressed against them and the dark in her chest so large now that it filled every space inside her, every vein, every breath, every heartbeat. Tonight the truth would come out. Tonight the banquet hall would become a killing floor. And by tomorrow morning, the palace would know who Celine Vale really was. And the woman in the next room, the woman Celine loved, the woman Celine had betrayed, would never look at her the same way again. The candles in the great hall numbered 3,000. Celine knew this because she had helped the household staff count them that afternoon, a task that the head of household had assigned to her with a smirk that suggested he was enjoying the irony of making the king's hidden mistress perform manual labor on the day of her unmasking. 3,000 candles, and every single one of them was lit. Celine hit the marble floor with her shoulder, and the impact drove the air from her lungs in a single violent burst. The blade meant for Evelina was buried in the muscle below her left collarbone, not deep enough to reach the lung, but deep enough that she felt the steel scrape against something hard inside her, cartilage or bone. She could not tell because the pain had not arrived yet. Pain is slower than metal. Pain takes a moment to understand what has happened to the body it lives in, and in that moment, that gap between injury and agony, Celine saw the ceiling of the great hall above her, 3,000 candles burning in their iron chandeliers. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her that the light looked like stars, and that she had not seen real stars since the border town, and that she might never see them again. Then the pain arrived. It came like a wave of boiling water poured into her chest, radiating outward from the wound in concentric circles of fire that reached her fingertips and her jaw and the backs of her eyes simultaneously. She heard herself make a sound that was not a scream and not a gasp, but something animal and involuntary, the sound a body makes when it has been opened by steel and is trying to communicate damage to a mind that is not yet ready to process it. Her left arm went heavy, her vision narrowed. She could feel blood, hot and immediate, spreading across her chest and pooling in the hollow of her throat where the gown's neckline had been torn by the fall. Above her, the world was ending. The great hall had become a slaughterhouse. The assassins, 6 of them, had emerged from the crowd the moment Crestfall's accusation had shattered the room's composure, moving with the coordinated precision of men who had rehearsed this in some basement or barn or abandoned barracks until the killing choreography was burned into their muscles. They wore the livery of servants. They carried short blades hidden in the folds of their clothing, and they had been placed at specific points around the hall to ensure that when the chaos began, they would be close enough to the royal table to reach the king and queen before the guards could react. The first guard died without drawing his weapon. He was a young man, barely 20, stationed at the eastern door, and the assassin who killed him did it with a single thrust under the ribs that dropped him to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The second guard managed to get his sword halfway out of its scabbard before a blade caught him across the throat, and he fell backward into a table loaded with crystal and silver that shattered under his weight with a sound like the end of everything civilized. Nobles scattered. The screaming was enormous, a wall of human terror that filled the hall and bounced off the vaulted ceiling and came back distorted and amplified until it sounded less like people and more like the building itself was in pain. Women in silk gowns clawed over each other to reach the doors. Men who had spent their lives discussing warfare from the comfort of council chambers discovered in the space of a heartbeat that theory and practice are separated by an ocean of blood, and most of them chose to run. Tables overturned, wine spilled across white linen and mixed with the first splashes of red that were appearing on the marble floor. Lucien moved. He moved the way Celine had always known he could move but had never seen, the way a man moves when the civilized layers are stripped away, and what remains is the animal underneath, the thing that was trained to fight before it was trained to govern. He seized a sword from the dead guard at the eastern door, the blade still warm from the man's grip, and he did not hesitate. He stepped into the first assassin's path and killed him with a single stroke that opened the man from shoulder to sternum. And the sound it made was wet and final, and Lucien's face did not change at all. His eyes were flat. His mouth was a line. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this, not the assassination, but the permission to stop pretending, the permission to be what he was underneath the crown and the strategy and the sleepless nights, which was a killer, efficient, and cold and built for exactly this kind of moment. "Protect the queen!" Lucien shouted, and his voice cut through the screaming like a blade through cloth. "Western door, get her out, now!" But the queen was not moving. Evelina was on her knees beside Celine. Her dark blue gown was soaking up blood from the floor, the silver embroidery turning black where it met the spreading stain. Her hands were pressed against Celine's wound, both of them, palms flat, fingers splayed, and the blood was coming up between her fingers in rhythmic pulses that matched Celine's heartbeat. And Evelina was saying something, repeating something, and it took Celine several seconds to understand that the queen was saying her name. "Celine. Celine, stay with me. Celine." Celine looked up at her. Evelina's face was close, inches away, and there was blood on her cheek, Celine's blood, a dark smear across the sharp line of her jaw, and her eyes were not afraid. That was the thing Celine noticed. In the middle of an assassination, with the hall erupting into violence around her, with her husband killing men 30 feet away, and her gown heavy with someone else's blood, Evelina Ashford was not afraid. She was furious. "Do not you dare," Evelina said. Her voice was low and hard and shaking with a rage that had nothing to do with the assassins and everything to do with the woman bleeding under her hands. "Do not you dare leave me in this palace alone." Celine tried to speak. Her mouth opened, but the words were behind the pain, trapped on the other side of it, and all that came out was a sound that tasted like copper. Two of the remaining assassins had broken through the chaos and were heading for the royal table. They moved shoulder to shoulder, blades low, eyes locked on the queen kneeling on the floor. They had been trained to prioritize, and a queen on her knees with her hands occupied and her guards scattered was the easiest target in the room. The first one reached them. Evelina looked up and saw him coming, and her hands did not leave Celine's wound. She did not scream. She did not flinch. She looked at the man with the blade, and she made a sound that Celine would remember for the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. It was not a word. It was a snarl. The sound of a woman who had been caged and starved and ignored and underestimated for 4 years, and who had just discovered, in the worst possible moment, that the cage had not broken her. It had compressed her. And compressed things, when they finally release, are more dangerous than anything that has been allowed to expand freely. The assassin hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. And it cost him everything, because in that fraction of a second, a figure came from his left and hit him with enough force to drive him sideways into the stone pillar beside the royal table. His head struck the pillar, and Celine heard the crack from 3 feet away, and then he was on the floor, and the figure who had tackled him was standing over him, breathing hard, and Celine saw through her narrowing vision that it was Aldrich, the thin steward with the hatchet face who catalogued everything, who had watched her with suspicion for weeks, who had probably reported her movements to half the court. Aldrich, who had no weapon and no armor and no training, had thrown himself at an armed assassin to protect the queen, and now he was standing over the unconscious man, and his hands were shaking and his face was white, but his eyes were steady. The second assassin adjusted course. He came around the other side of the table, fast, blade up, and Evelina saw him, and this time she moved. She grabbed the heavy silver candelabra from the center of the royal table, the one that held 12 candles and weighed more than a sword, and she swung it with both hands. The base caught the assassin across the face, and he staggered, and Evelina hit him again, harder, and this time he went down, and the candelabra bent against his skull. And hot wax sprayed across the tablecloth, and Evelina stood over him with the ruined candelabra in her hands, and blood on her gown and blood on her face, and she was breathing the way animals breathe after a fight, ragged and deep and trembling. Lucien killed the fourth assassin near the western door. The fifth was brought down by 3 guards who had finally organized themselves into something resembling a defensive formation. The sixth, the last one, tried to run. He made it as far as the servants' corridor behind the kitchens, before a guard's crossbow bolt caught him between the shoulder blades, and he fell face first into the stone floor and did not move again. The hall went quiet, not silent. There was still the sound of sobbing, and the groans of the wounded, and the drip of spilled wine from overturned tables, and the distant shouts of guards securing the corridors. But the violence had stopped. The killing had stopped, And in the sudden absence of immediate danger, the survivors began to process what had just happened, and the processing sounded like grief.
Lucian crossed the hall at a run. He dropped the sword. He dropped to his knees beside Celine, and his hands replaced Evelina's on the wound, and he pressed hard, too hard, and Celine gasped and her back arched against the floor. "Get the physician," Lucien said. His voice was hoarse. "Get him now." "He is dead," someone said from across the hall. "The court physician. They killed him first." Lucien's jaw clenched. She watched the muscle in his cheek work, and she saw something break behind his eyes. Not the strategic mind, not the king, but the man underneath. The man from the harvest festival, the man who had danced with her in winter wheat, and that man was terrified in a way the king would never allow himself to be. "Find another one," Lucien said. "Find anyone who can stitch a wound. Go." A servant ran. Lucien looked down at Celine and she looked up at him, and between them there was nothing but the truth. Finally, the raw, ugly truth of what they were and what they had done and what it had cost. His hands were on her chest, and her blood was on his skin, and the woman he had married was kneeling beside them both, watching. Evelina was watching. She had not moved from Celine's side. Her bloody hands were resting on her knees, and her face was a mask that Celine could not read. Not anger, not grief, not the shock of betrayal, but something deeper, something structural, the expression of a woman whose understanding of the world has just been demolished, and who is standing in the rubble, trying to figure out which pieces are worth salvaging. Lucien looked at Evelina. Evelina looked at Lucien. And in that look, in that single-held gaze across the body of the woman they had both claimed in different ways, the marriage of Lucien Draven and Evelina Ashford reached its final honest moment. No words, no politics, no strategy. Just two people looking at each other over a wound that they had both, in different ways, helped to create. "Move," Evelina said. Lucien blinked. "What?" "Move your hands. Let me see the wound." Evelina: "I spent 6 months watching Celine brew tinctures and set bones and stitch the hem of my dresses with a precision that no chambermaid possesses. She is a healer. She told me that herself. And I've watched her closely enough to learn more than you think. So move your hands, Lucien. Let me see." Lucien stared at his wife. Something moved across his face that Celine, even through the haze of pain and blood loss, recognized as something he had never shown Evelina before. It was respect. Not the diplomatic respect of a king for his queen, the raw, involuntary respect of a man who has just discovered that the person he dismissed is stronger than he is. He moved his hands. Evelina leaned forward and examined the wound. Her fingers were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She pressed the edges of the torn skin together and blood welled between her fingers, and she did not flinch. "The blade missed the lung," Evelina said. Her voice was clinical and calm and did not match the blood on her face or the chaos around them. "It is lodged in the muscle below the collarbone. It needs to come out, but not here. Not in this hall. She needs a clean room and boiling water and silk thread and a needle small enough for suturing. Can you carry her?" The last question was directed at Lucien. He nodded once. He slid his arms under Celine's body and lifted her, and she felt herself rise from the bloody marble floor, and the movement sent a wave of agony through her chest that whited out her vision for a full second. When it cleared, she was in his arms, and his face was above her, and he was carrying her through the wreckage of the great hall, past overturned tables and shattered glass and bodies that she did not want to look at, and candles that were still burning, 3,000 candles still burning, because fire does not care about politics or betrayal or the broken hearts of the people who lit it. Evelina walked ahead of them. She walked with her spine straight, and her bloody hands at her sides, and nobles stepped out of her path without being asked. And Celine, watching from Lucien's arms through a narrowing tunnel of consciousness, saw the court see their queen for the first time. Not the northern wife, not the political bride, not the decorative bridge. The woman who had stood in the middle of an assassination and fought with a candelabra, and then knelt in blood to save the life of the servant who had been sleeping with her husband. The court saw that woman walk through the wreckage of the winter banquet, and they did not know what to do with what they were seeing because it did not fit any model of queenship they had been taught. And so they did the only thing the human brain does when confronted with something it cannot categorize. They stood still and stared. Evelina did not look at them. She walked. They reached the western tower. Evelina's sitting room became a makeshift surgery. She cleared the books from the table by the window and spread a clean linen sheet over it and pointed at it, and Lucien laid Celine down and the table was hard under her back,
and the ceiling was spinning, and the candles in this room were few, only 4, and their light was thin and yellow and flickered in the draft from the window. A healer from the lower city arrived within the hour, a man named Corvin, who smelled like garlic and wood smoke, and who took one look at the wound and one look at the amount of blood on the floor and asked for whiskey, not to sterilize the wound but to drink, because he said you do not pull a blade from a woman's chest sober and expect steady hands. Evelina did not leave the room. Lucian stood by the door. He had washed Celine's blood from his hands, but it had stained the cuffs of his white shirt, and the stains were turning brown as they dried, and he kept looking at them, at the brown stains on his cuffs, as if they were a text he was trying to read. Corvin worked. He removed the blade with a practiced motion that made Celine's body convulse on the table and her teeth clamp down on the leather strap Evelina had placed between her jaws. The pain was a color, white and absolute, and it filled her skull and pushed out everything else, every thought, every memory, every lie, until there was nothing left but the animal fact of her body trying to survive what had been done to it. Corvin cauterized the wound with a heated iron, and the smell of her own flesh burning reached her nostrils, and her stomach revolted, and she turned her head and retched, and Evelina held her head and said nothing. And Corvin stitched the wound with silk thread, and his hands were steady after all, whiskey or no whiskey. And when it was done, he packed the wound with a poultice that smelled like the border town, like chamomile and rendered tallow and something bitter, the same recipe Selene had used on Evelina's cracked hands weeks ago. "She will live," Corvin said. He wiped his hands on a cloth that had been white and was now red. The blade was short and poorly aimed, an inch to the left, and we would be having a different conversation. Keep the wound clean, change the poultice twice a day, and for the sake of every power that governs this miserable world, do not let her move that arm for at least 2 weeks. He took his whiskey and his fee and left. The room was quiet. Celine lay on the table and stared at the ceiling and breathed. Each breath cost her something, a small, bright coin of pain that she paid into the wound and received nothing back. She could feel the stitches pulling with each inhale, the thread tugging at her torn skin, a reminder that she was held together now by something external, something that could be cut or unraveled or removed. Lucian had not moved from the door. Evelina stood beside the table. Her hands were clean now, but the blood had dried under her nails and in the creases of her knuckles, and she had not changed out of the dark blue gown. The gown she had chosen to look frightening, the gown that was now stiff with Celine's blood from hem to waist. Nobody spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full of things that needed to be said and could not be said and would have to be said eventually because the alternative was suffocation. 3 people in a room, bound together by desire and deception and a knife wound, and the lies that had held them in formation for weeks were gone now, burned away in the heat of the banquet hall, and what remained was the raw architecture of what they actually were to each other. A king who had loved selfishly, a queen who had survived gracefully, and a woman on a table who had tried to love them both and had been destroyed by the contradiction. Lucien spoke first. "Evelina," he said. His voice was the voice of a man standing on a ledge, each word chosen with the knowledge that the wrong one would end him. "I need to tell you." "I know," Evelina said. 2 words, flat, final, delivered without looking at him. Lucien stopped. "I have known since before tonight," Evelina said. She was looking at Celine, not at Lucien, at Celine. And her eyes, those exhausted eyes that Celine had seen on the first day in this tower, were not exhausted anymore. They were awake, wide awake, burning with something that was not anger and not grief, but was adjacent to both. A neighbor that shared a wall with fury and sorrow and could hear them both through the stone. "You talk in your sleep," Evelina said to Celine. "You said his name. Weeks ago. I heard it and I did not want to believe it, so I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself that servants might dream about kings the way anyone might dream about the people who govern their lives. But then I watched you. I watched the way you moved when he entered a room. I watched the way your breathing changed. I watched the way your hands went still whenever someone mentioned his name, the way a hunted animal goes still when it hears the hunter's step. And I knew. I knew before Crestfall opened his mouth. I knew before tonight. I have known for weeks." Celine's eyes burned, not from the pain, from the weight of being seen, from the devastating precision of Evelina's observation, from the realization that the woman she had been lying to had been watching her with the same careful attention that Celine had been watching her, and that both of them had been reading each other perfectly while pretending to see nothing.
I am sorry, Celine whispered. The words were inadequate. She knew they were inadequate. They were a cup of water offered to a woman whose house was on fire. Evelina's jaw tightened. She looked away from Celine and out the window where the sky was black and starless, and the capital was dark except for the torches on the palace walls. Her profile was sharp in the candlelight. Her hands were fists at her sides. Sorry, Evelina repeated. The word came out like a stone being dropped into still water. You are sorry. Yes. For which part? For loving my husband. For lying to me. For letting me believe I finally had someone in this palace who saw me as a person instead of a political instrument. For sitting in my chair and eating my bread and holding my hand in the garden while you were sneaking through corridors to his bed. Which part are you sorry for, Celine? Because I need to know which piece of my heart you are apologizing for breaking so I can decide if there is enough left to keep me standing. Celine closed her eyes. The stitches pulled, the poultice burned, and the dark in her chest, the dark she had carried since the day she walked through the servants' gate, opened like a mouth and swallowed the last of whatever she had been using to hold herself together. All of it, Celine said. Every part, every lie. Every morning I sat across from you and pretended I was only your maid. Every night I lay on my cot and listened to you breathe and hated myself for what I was doing to you. Every moment of care I gave you that was real, genuinely real, and was also a betrayal because I had no right to care for someone I was deceiving. All of it, Evelina. I am sorry for all of it. Evelina turned back to her. Her eyes were wet, but nothing fell. She held it. She held everything, the way she had held everything for 4 years, because queens do not cry in rooms where other people can see them, and even now, even in this moment, the discipline held. She looked at Lucien. He had not moved from the door. His face was the face of a man watching the consequences of his choices arrive, one after another, in a procession he cannot stop and cannot escape and cannot look away from. Did you love her? Evelina asked. Her voice was controlled. Before me. Before the marriage. Did you love her first? Lucien's chest rose and fell. Yes, he said. And you brought her here, into my household, into my home. Yes, because you could not let her go. Because I could not let her go. Evelina nodded. It was a small nod, the kind that acknowledges receipt of information rather than acceptance of it. She looked at the floor. She looked at the blood on the floor, Celine's blood, her own bloody footprints tracked across the stone from the table to the window and back. She looked at the ruin of the blue gown and the ruin of the evening and the ruin of the marriage and the ruin of the trust, and she stood in the middle of all of it and she did not collapse. She straightened. She breathed. And then Queen Evelina Ashford did something that neither Lucien nor Celine expected. She pulled the chair from beside the chess table, the chair where she had once asked Celine to sit, the chair where they had shared their first honest silence, and she placed it beside the table where Celine was lying, and she sat down, and she took Celine's hand, the right hand, the one that was not on the wounded side, and she held it. I should hate you, Evelina said. She was looking at Celine's hand in hers. Her thumb moved across Celine's knuckles once, slowly, the way you touch something you are deciding whether to keep or discard. I should hate you, and I should hate him, and I should have you both removed from my sight and spend the rest of my life as the wronged queen who was betrayed by her husband and her closest companion. That is what the court would expect. That is what the nobles would applaud. That is the story that makes sense. She paused. Her thumb stopped moving. But you stepped in front of a blade for me, Evelina said, and I cannot make that fit the story of a woman who wanted to destroy me. I have been trying for the last hour, and I cannot make it fit. Because a woman who wanted my crown or my husband or my ruin would not have bled for me on that floor. She would have stepped aside. She would have let the blade find me. She would have solved every problem in her life by doing nothing. And you did not do nothing. You did the opposite of nothing. You chose me over your own body. Celine's throat closed. She could feel Evelina's hand gripping hers, and she could feel the tears she had been refusing to cry for weeks building behind her eyes, like floodwater behind a dam, and she knew the dam was going to break, and she could not stop it. I did not think, Celine said. Her voice cracked. I saw the blade, and I saw you, and I did not think. There was no choice. There was just you. Evelina's grip tightened. Her eyes closed for a moment. When they opened, the tears she had been holding were on her lashes but still had not fallen. She looked at Lucien. Get out, she said. Lucien flinched. Evelina,
I am not asking you to leave the palace. I am not asking you to abdicate. I am asking you to leave this room, right now, tonight. Because if you stay, I will say things that cannot be unsaid, and I am not ready to burn that bridge until I know what is on the other side. So go. Sleep in your warm study in your warm wing, and tomorrow, when the court assembles and the blood has been cleaned from the banquet hall and the empire demands answers, we will stand together and we will deal with Crestfall, and we will hold this throne together because that is what survival requires. But tonight, Lucien, tonight you do not get to be in this room. Lucien stood at the door and looked at his wife, and Celine saw something on his face she had never seen in 6 years of loving him. She saw him understand, not strategize, not calculate. Understand. The full, unmediated comprehension of what he had done and what it had cost and who had paid the price. It moved across his face like weather, like a storm crossing a landscape, and when it passed, his eyes were different, not softer, clearer. The eyes of a man who has finally seen the wreckage he built and cannot unsee it. He left. The door closed. And in the western tower, in the cold room with the thin tapestries and the 4 candles and the blood on the floor, the queen held the hand of the woman who had betrayed her and the woman who had saved her, because they were the same woman, and the night was long, and neither of them knew what morning would bring. Outside, the palace guards secured the corridors. Servants collected the dead. The 3,000 candles in the great hall burned down to their iron holders and guttered out one by one, and the darkness that replaced them was total and absolute and smelled like smoke and copper. In his study, Lucien sat in the chair by the fire and did not drink and did not sleep and stared at the brown stains on his cuffs and thought about the harvest festival and the winter wheat and the girl who had danced with him when he was nothing but a boy pretending to be ordinary. And he understood finally the way you understand the full dimensions of a wound only after the bleeding stops, that he had taken that girl and put her in a cage and called the cage devotion and told himself the story that cages built from love were different from cages built from cruelty. And the story was a lie. It had always been a lie, and the proof was the blood on his sleeves and the woman on the table and the wife in the chair beside her holding the hand he should have held, doing the work he should have done, being the person he had never been brave enough to be. The fire burned low. The night continued, and in the rooms beneath the palace, in the cells where the surviving assassins had been chained, a man with a broken face and a crossbow bolt lodged between his shoulder blades was not dead. He was breathing. Shallow, wet, labored breaths that rattled in his chest like stones in a tin cup. And when the guard checked on him at the 4th bell, the man opened his eyes and said a single word. Crestfall. The guard leaned closer. There are more, the man said. His voice was a whisper wrapped in blood. The banquet was not the plan. The banquet was the distraction. The guard straightened. His face went white. The plan is the trial, the man said. And then his eyes closed and his breathing stopped and the cell went quiet. Above him, in the western tower, Evelina held Celine's hand and watched the window for dawn. And dawn, when it finally came, brought with it not light but the gray, heavy promise of a storm that had not yet decided whether to break or to wait. And the palace held its breath. And the empire held its breath. And somewhere in the capital, in a townhouse with iron gates and drawn curtains, Duke Edmund Crestfall sat at his desk and wrote a letter and sealed it, and handed it to a courier who rode south before the sun cleared the walls. The trial was set for 3 days hence, and the assassin's dying words, rattling through the corridors of the palace dungeon like a curse that could not be unspoken, reached the ears of the captain of the guard, who brought them to the king, who brought them to the queen, who looked at the woman lying on the table in her sitting room and understood with a cold and absolute certainty that the fight in the banquet hall was not the end of anything. It was the beginning, and what was coming next would make the winter banquet look like a rehearsal. The letter Crestfall sent south was intercepted on the 2nd day. It was not luck. It was Evelina. She had dispatched 3 riders before dawn on the morning after the banquet, each one carrying orders sealed with the queen's personal sigil, a sigil she had not used in 4 years because she had never had reason to exercise the authority it represented. The orders were addressed to the garrison commanders at the southern crossroads, the 3 checkpoints that controlled all courier traffic between the capital and the provinces below the river. The orders were simple. Stop every rider carrying correspondence sealed with the Crestfall crest. Open nothing. Deliver everything to the palace. The rider was caught at the 2nd checkpoint, 18 miles south of the capital, at a bridge where the road narrowed between 2 limestone bluffs. He was young, barely 20, and he did not resist. He handed over the letter and a second document hidden in the lining of his saddlebag, and he said nothing because he had been paid to ride, not to die, and the garrison soldiers who surrounded him made it clear that the distinction between the two was currently negotiable. The letter and the document reached the palace by mid-afternoon. Evelina read them both at the table in her sitting room, the same table where Celine had been operated on the night before. The bloodstains had been scrubbed but not entirely removed. They remained as faint brown shadows in the grain of the wood, ghost marks that would never fully disappear no matter how hard anyone cleaned them. Celine was conscious. She was lying on a cot that had been moved into the sitting room because Evelina refused to let her be taken to the servants' quarters or the palace infirmary or anywhere else that was out of sight. The wound was hot and tight under the poultice, and her left arm was bound to her chest with a linen sling, and every breath still cost her a small payment of pain. But she was alive and alert, and watching Evelina read the letter with the focused attention of someone who understands that the document in the Queen's hands will determine whether anyone in this room survives the week. Evelina finished reading. She set the letter down. She picked up the second document, the one from the saddlebag lining, and read it more slowly. Her face did not change, her breathing did not change, but her fingers holding the edges of the document went white at the tips. She set the document down. She looked at the wall. She was quiet for a long time. Celine waited. She had learned in the weeks she had spent in this tower that Evelina's silences were not empty. They were processing. The Queen thought the way a chess player thinks, in sequences, in patterns, in the cascading consequences of each possible move, and the silence was the sound of that machinery working. Evelina spoke. The letter is addressed to Lord Voss in the southern province. It instructs him to mobilize the grain levy and withhold shipments to the capital until further notice. The second document is a draft proclamation. It declares Lucien unfit to rule on grounds of moral corruption and names Crestfall as Lord Protector pending the convening of a new succession council. Celine's breath caught. That is a coup.
That is exactly what it is, Evelina said. Her voice was level, controlled, the voice of a woman who has found the enemy's battle plan and is already 3 moves into her counter. He orchestrated the scandal to weaken Lucy Yezien publicly. He hired the assassins to create chaos and eliminate us if possible, and the trial he demanded is not about justice. It is a stage. He intends to use it to present Lucien as a degenerate king who endangered the empire for a mistress, strip him of legitimacy in front of the court, and install himself as regent. The assassination was his backup plan in case the political strategy failed. He has been building this for months, maybe years. Celine stared at the ceiling. The pain in her chest was steady and rhythmic, a pulse of heat with each heartbeat, and she used it as an anchor, something real and physical to hold on to while the political architecture of the empire shifted and cracked around her. "What are you going to do?" Celine asked. Evelina stood. She crossed the room and stood at the window and looked out at the capital, and her reflection in the glass was sharp and clear and cold. "I am going to do the thing no one in this palace expects," Evelina said. "I am going to save the throne. Not Lucien's throne. The throne." The distinction mattered. Celine heard it and understood it and recognized in that single correction the shift that had been building inside Evelina for weeks. The Queen was no longer thinking of herself as the king's wife. She was thinking of herself as the other half of the crown. Not beside it, not beneath it. Part of it. Evelina turned from the window. "I need you to do something for me," she said, "and you are not going to like it." Celine looked at her. "After everything I have done to you, you are asking me for help." Evelina's mouth tightened. "I'm not asking you because I have forgiven you. I'm asking you because you are the only person in this palace who knows the full truth, who has nothing left to lose, and who has already demonstrated a willingness to bleed for me. Those 3 qualities make you the most useful person in the empire right now. Forgiveness is a separate conversation, and we will have it, but not today." Celine held Evelina's gaze. The honesty in it was brutal. There was no warmth. There was no tenderness. There was only the cold, pragmatic clarity of a woman who has learned to build with whatever materials are available, even if those materials are stained and imperfect and came from a source she has every right to despise. "Tell me what you need," Celine said. Evelina told her. The trial convened on the 3rd day after the banquet in the Great Hall, which had been cleaned but not restored. The broken tables had been removed. The shattered glass had been swept.
The bloodstains on the marble floor had been scrubbed until they were pale pink shadows, visible only if you knew where to look. But the hall still smelled like smoke and iron, and the 3,000 candle holders hung empty from the chandeliers, black iron skeletons stripped of their wax and flame. And the effect was of a room that had been gutted and was waiting to see what would be put back inside it. The court assembled. Every noble house, every council member, every ambassador and military commander and merchant of influence in the capital. They filled the gallery seats that lined both sides of the hall, and they stood along the walls and they crowded the doorways, and the silence they brought with them was the silence of an audience that knows it is about to witness something irreversible. Duke Edmund Crestfall stood at the center of the hall. He was dressed in black. His silver hair was combed back from his face, and his posture was the posture of a man who believes he is standing on the right side of history. Beside him stood Lady Ashworth and Lord Harkin and 3 other nobles whose names Celine did not know, but whose faces she recognized from the corridors, the faces of people who had watched her with anticipation, who had known what was coming because they had been told, because they were part of it, because Crestfall had assembled them the way a general assembles a regiment. Lucian entered from the eastern door. He wore the crown. He had not worn it at the banquet, and Celine understood the choice. The crown was not decoration. It was a statement. It was the physical manifestation of the authority Crestfall was trying to strip from him, and Lucien was wearing it the way a soldier wears armor, not for comfort, but for survival. Evelina entered from the western door. She wore the dark blue gown, the same one, the one from the banquet. It had been cleaned, but not perfectly. There were still traces of blood in the silver embroidery, faint rust-colored shadows that caught the light when she moved. She had chosen it deliberately. Celine knew this because Evelina had told her, standing in the dressing chamber that morning with the gown in her hands, turning it over, studying the stains. "They need to see the blood," Evelina had said. "They need to remember what happened in this hall 3 nights ago. They need to remember that while they were running, I was kneeling in it." Evelina walked to the front of the hall and stood beside Lucien. She did not take his arm. She did not stand behind him. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and the court watched, and the court saw, and the court began to recalculate. Crestfall did not recalculate. He had committed. He had built his case and assembled his allies and sent his letters, and the machine was in motion, and he could not stop it now, even if he wanted to, which he did not, because Duke Edmund Crestfall had spent 20 years waiting for this moment, and he was not going to let the sight of a queen in a bloody gown steal it from him. He began. He spoke well. Celine, watching from the gallery where Evelina had placed her, visible to the entire court, her arm in its sling, her face pale from blood loss, her wound a testament that she could not have hidden even if she wanted to. Celine listened to Crestfall speak, and she gave him this. The man could build a narrative. He laid out his case with the precision of an architect, each accusation a brick, each piece of evidence the mortar between them. The king had taken a mistress. The mistress had been hidden in the queen's household. The deception had lasted months. The crown's moral authority was compromised. The empire deserved better. He presented Lady Ashworth. She testified that she had observed unusual familiarity between the king and his wife's chambermaid. She was calm. She was credible. She described what she had seen, and she did not embellish, and the court listened. He presented Lord Harkin. Harkin produced the timeline of Celine's movements, the gaps, the evening absences, the eastern corridor visits. He was nervous but thorough, and the timeline was damning because it was accurate. He presented a guard who had been stationed near the king's study, and who testified that he had seen a woman matching Celine's description entering and leaving the eastern wing after dark on multiple occasions. Crestfall let the testimony accumulate. He let the weight of it build. He let the court sit with it and absorb it and draw their conclusions. And then he turned to Lucien and he said, "Your Majesty, the evidence speaks clearly. Your private conduct has endangered the stability of the empire. The assassination at the banquet was a direct consequence of the chaos your deception created. I propose that you submit to a Regency Council pending a full investigation, and that the woman known as Celine Vale be remanded to the dungeons to await sentencing for her role in the corruption of the crown." The hall was silent. Lucien stood with the crown on his head and his hands at his sides, and his face was the face of a man who has been struck and is deciding whether to strike back or absorb the blow. Celine could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of options, the weighing of costs, the strategic mind doing what it always did. But before Lucien could speak, Evelina stepped forward. She stepped in front of Lucien, not beside him, in front of him. She placed herself between the king and the duke and the entire court, and the movement was deliberate and unmistakable, and it sent a ripple through the gallery that Celine could feel from 30 feet away.
Duke Crestfall, Evelina said. Her voice was not loud. She did not need it to be. The hall was so quiet that the sound of her breathing would have been audible in the back row. You have presented evidence of my husband's infidelity. I will not dispute it. The king maintained a relationship with Celine Vale. This is true. It is painful. It is a betrayal that I will carry for the rest of my life, and I will address it privately, within the walls of my marriage, in the manner I choose. At the time I choose, without the guidance or permission of this court. She paused. The silence was total. But you have not presented evidence of corruption, Evelina continued. You have presented evidence of a man's weakness. And weakness, Duke Crestfall, while disappointing, is not a crime. It is not grounds for regency. It is not grounds for the removal of a sovereign. If every king who took a mistress were deposed, there would not be a throne left standing in the known world. And you know this. And every person in this hall knows this. And the fact that you have attempted to build a coup on the foundation of a marital indiscretion tells me that your interest is not in justice. It is in power. Crestfall's face changed. Not much. A tightening around the eyes, a stiffness in the jaw, the subtle physical markers of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath his feet is not as solid as he thought. Your Majesty, he said, and his voice was still smooth, but the smoothness had developed a crack. The assassination. The assassination, Evelina said, was funded by you. The hall erupted. Evelina raised her hand. The eruption subsided. Celine watched and felt something she had not felt since arriving at the palace. She felt awe. Not the decorative awe of subjects watching a queen perform her role, the raw, involuntary awe of a human being watching another human being become the thing they were always supposed to be. 2 days ago, Evelina said, my riders intercepted a courier carrying your correspondence and a document bearing your seal. The letter instructed Lord Voss to withhold grain shipments to the capital. The document was a draft proclamation naming you Lord Protector of the Empire. These are not the actions of a concerned noble seeking justice. These are the actions of a man staging a coup, and I have copies of both documents, signed and sealed, which I will now present to this court. She turned and nodded to Aldrich, who stood at the eastern door. The steward stepped forward and carried a leather satchel to the center of the hall and opened it and removed the letter and the document and placed them on the table that had been set up for the proceedings. The court craned forward. The nobles in the gallery shifted and murmured. Crestfall stood very still. Evelina was not finished. Furthermore, she said, the surviving assassin from the banquet before his death identified you by name as the organizer of the attack. His testimony was witnessed by the captain of the guard and 2 palace officials. I will call them now. She called them. The captain of the guard testified. The 2 officials corroborated. The dying man's words, Crestfall and the plan is the trial, rang through the hall with the finality of a door slamming shut. Crestfall tried to speak. He tried to challenge the evidence. He tried to discredit the dying man's testimony as the ravings of a wounded criminal. He tried to redirect the court's attention back to the king's infidelity, back to Celine, back to the moral argument that had been his weapon for weeks. But the weapon had been turned. The court was no longer looking at the king. The court was looking at Crestfall. And the expression on their faces was the expression of people who have just realized they were standing next to a fire they mistook for a lantern. Lady Ashworth stood up from her seat and walked to the center of the hall and stood before Evelina and said, I was approached by the Duke 6 weeks ago. He asked me to observe the Queen's household and to testify at this trial. He offered to restore my pension in exchange. I agreed because I was desperate and angry. I did not know about the assassination. I did not know about the coup. I am telling you this now because I would rather face the court's judgment for my part in the deception than stand beside a man who orchestrates murder. Harkin tried to disappear into the gallery. He did not make it to the door. 2 guards intercepted him, and he stood between them with his timeline crumpled in his fist and his face the color of old paper, and he said nothing because there was nothing left to say. Crestfall looked at the court. He looked at the evidence on the table. He looked at his allies crumbling around him. He looked at Evelina standing in her blood-stained gown with the authority of a woman who has stopped asking for permission and started taking what the empire owes her. And Celine, watching from the gallery with her wound burning and her heart hammering, saw something happen to Crestfall's face that she would think about for years afterward. She saw it empty, not collapse, not crumble. Empty. The way a house empties when the last person walks out and closes the door. 20 years of planning, 20 years of rage and ambition and meticulous patience, and it was gone in the space of 15 minutes, dismantled by a queen he had never bothered to calculate as a threat. Duke Edmund Crestfall, Lucian said, and his voice was the voice of a king delivering judgment, which is what he was. You are stripped of your title, your lands, and your seat on the council. You are sentenced to exile beyond the borders of the empire. You will leave the capital under guard within 24 hours. If you are found within the empire's borders after that time, you will be executed. Crestfall looked at Lucian. Then he looked at Evelina, and he said the last words he would ever speak inside the palace walls. She will make a better ruler than you, he said to Lucian. He was looking at Evelina when he said it. And the strange thing, the thing that Celine carried with her long after the trial was over and the court had dispersed and the palace had begun the slow work of reassembling itself, was that Crestfall meant it. It was the most honest thing he had ever said. And it was the one thing on which every person in that hall agreed. Guards escorted him out. The doors closed behind him, and the great hall, emptied of its villain, began to breathe again. 3 days after the trial, Evelina came to Celine's cot in the sitting room. It was early morning. The light was gray. The fire was low. And the queen sat in the chair beside the cot and looked at Celine with eyes that were no longer burning or furious or cold, but something else. Something that looked like the landscape after a wildfire, scorched and bare and raw, but with the faintest green pushing up through the black. I have spent 3 days deciding what to do about you, Evelina said. Celine looked at her. She did not speak. She had learned painfully that the most important thing she could give Evelina now was silence. Space. The room to arrive at her own conclusions without the interference of the woman who had upended her life. I cannot forgive you yet, Evelina said. I want to be honest about that. What you did, what you both did, it broke something inside me that I do not know how to repair. You were the first person in this palace I trusted, the first person I chose, and the entire time, you were the answer to the question I had been asking since my wedding night. You were the ghost in my marriage. You were the reason my husband looked through me instead of at me, and you sat across from me and drank my tea and held my hand and let me believe I had finally found someone real. Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose, and the green in her eyes flickered but held. But I also cannot condemn you, Evelina continued, because the woman who did those things is the same woman who stepped in front of a blade for me, the same woman who brewed medicine for my hands and warm stones for my bed and sat with me in silence when silence was the only honest thing left. I have tried to separate those two women. I have tried to make you into the villain or the victim or the traitor or the savior, and none of those words hold all of you. You are all of them. You are every contradictory thing a person can be. And hating you for one part means hating the whole, and I find I am not willing to do that. Celine's eyes were wet. She did not wipe them. She let the tears come because they were the most honest thing she had. And Evelina deserved honesty, deserved it more than anyone she had ever known. What happens now? Celine asked. Evelina was quiet for a moment. Now I rebuild, she said. Not the marriage. The marriage will survive because the empire needs it to survive, but it will be different. I have told Lucien that I will rule beside him as an equal sovereign, not behind him as a decoration. He agreed. He did not have a choice, but I think he also meant it. The man I saw kneeling on that banquet floor with your blood on his hands was not the same man who put you in my household. Something broke inside him too. Whether it heals into something better or worse, I do not know. But it will be different. And me, Celine said. Evelina looked at her. Her face was complicated, layered. The face of a woman holding grief and gratitude and betrayal and tenderness in the same two hands and refusing to drop any of them. You cannot stay, Evelina said. You know that. Celine closed her eyes. Yes, she said. I know. Not because I am punishing you, because this palace will destroy you if you remain. You will be the king's former mistress for the rest of your life if you stay within these walls. Every noble will watch you. Every servant will whisper about you. You will never be free of it. And you deserve to be free, Celine. Whatever else you are, whatever else you have done, you deserve a life that is not defined by this. Celine opened her eyes. Evelina was still looking at her, and in that look Celine saw the things she had been terrified of, and the things she had been hoping for, both at once, tangled together like roots. She saw the end of what they had been,
and the beginning of what they might become, separately, at a distance, in the long years ahead. She saw grief, and she saw release, and she saw something that was not yet forgiveness, but was the ground forgiveness might one day grow from.
"Where will you go?" Evelina asked. "North," Celine said. "The border provinces. There is a town where I apprenticed with a healer. They need healers there. They always need healers." Evelina nodded. She reached out and took Celine's hand, the right hand, the one without the wound, and she held it the way she had held it on the night of the banquet, firmly, deliberately, with full awareness of everything that hand had done and everything it represented.
"If you ever need anything," Evelina said, "if you are ever hungry or cold or sick or afraid, send word to me, not to the crown, to me, Evelina, and I will answer." Celine gripped the queen's hand, and the tears fell freely now, both of them, and they sat together in the gray morning light and said nothing because there was nothing left to say that was equal to what they were feeling, and the silence between them was the most honest silence they had ever shared because it was the first one that contained no lies. Celine left the palace on a Tuesday. She went through the servants' gate on the eastern wall, the same gate she had entered through weeks ago, the one behind the horse stables where the cobblestones were cracked and stained. She carried one leather bag. Inside it, 2 changes of clothes, a bone comb missing 3 teeth, and a letter from Evelina that she had not yet read because she was saving it for the road, for the moment when the palace was behind her and the open country was ahead, and she could breathe without the weight of stone walls pressing down on her from every direction. She did not say goodbye to Lucien. She did not need to. He was standing at the window of his study in the eastern wing when she crossed the courtyard, and she knew he was there because she could feel his eyes on her the way she had always felt them, heavy and focused and burning with something that he still called love, and that she now understood was something else, something that had love's shape but not its substance, the way a shadow has a body's shape but not its warmth. She did not look up. She walked through the gate and into the street, and the city swallowed her, and the palace shrank behind her with every step until it was just a shape on the horizon, a dark mass of stone against a gray sky. And then it was gone. She took the northern road. The road was long and cold and empty in a way that was different from the emptiness of the palace. The palace emptiness was the emptiness of a room full of people who cannot see each other. The road emptiness was clean. It was the emptiness of open space and moving air and the honest silence of a landscape that does not require anything from you except that you keep walking. She walked for 3 days. She slept in roadside inns that smelled like wood smoke and hay. She ate bread and cheese and drank tea that was never as strong as Evelina's. Her wound ached when the temperature dropped, and she changed the poultice twice a day the way Corvin had instructed. And she watched the stitches slowly pull the edges of her skin together and thought about how wounds heal, how the body builds new tissue to bridge the gap left by the blade, how the new tissue is different from the old, tougher, less flexible, a scar that serves as both closure and memory. On the 4th day, she opened Evelina's letter. She was sitting on a stone wall at the edge of a ridge that overlooked the northern valley. The border town was visible below, a cluster of roofs and chimneys, and the thin line of the river that ran through its center. The healer's house, the place where she had learned her trade and fallen in love with a prince disguised as a common man, was down there somewhere, small and ordinary and waiting. The letter was short. Evelina's handwriting was precise and angular, the handwriting of a woman who chose her words the way she chose her gowns, deliberately, with full awareness of their weight. Celine, I will not write you a long letter because long letters are for people who are trying to say something they cannot say directly, and I have had enough of indirectness to last a lifetime. You hurt me. You also saved me. I do not know how to hold both of those truths at the same time, but I am learning. I think that is what being human is, learning to hold contradictions without letting them tear you apart. You taught me that, not with words, with the way you lived inside this impossible situation and somehow managed to care for me with genuine tenderness while carrying a guilt that must have been crushing. I am not grateful for the deception, but I'm grateful for the tenderness. And I am grateful that when the blade came, you chose me. I will remember that for the rest of my life. Go north, heal people, be free. And if the dark inside your chest ever gets too large, remember that there is a woman in a cold tower who knows your name and who, against all reason and all logic and all the rules that govern how betrayed people are supposed to feel, misses you. Evelina. Celine folded the letter. She held it against her chest, against the wound, and she looked out at the valley, and she breathed. The air was cold and clean, and it filled her lungs in a way that the palace air never had, completely, without restriction, without the taste of stone and secrets. She climbed down from the wall and walked into the valley. In the capital, Evelina stood at the window of her sitting room in the western tower and watched the sun set behind the western mountains. The fire behind her was built high. The wood supply had been tripled on her orders. The tower was warm for the first time in 4 years. On the table beside her, the chess set was arranged mid-game. She had been playing against herself again, but this time the game was different. This time she was not playing to pass the time. She was playing to practice, to think in sequences, to see the board clearly. Because the woman who had survived a banquet massacre and dismantled a coup and restructured a monarchy in 3 days did not intend to stop. Lucien knocked on her door that evening. He did not enter without permission. He knocked and waited, and when she said, "Come in," he entered and stood near the door and looked at her. And she looked at him, and between them there was 4 years of absence and 3 days of reckoning and the long, uncertain road that lay ahead. "She is gone," Lucien said. "I know," Evelina said. Lucien was quiet. Then he said, "I destroyed this." Evelina considered him. She considered the crown on his desk and the empty chair by his fire and the brown stains on the cuffs he had not yet washed. She considered the man who had married her for politics and loved another woman for passion, and who had never until the blood on the banquet floor forced him, considered that the woman he married might be the stronger of the two. "Yes," Evelina said, "you destroyed this. And now we build something else. Not because I have forgiven you, I have not. But because this empire does not care about our pain. It cares about our function. And I have decided that my function will no longer be decoration. I will govern beside you. I will sign what you sign. I will sit where you sit. I will have access to every council meeting, every military briefing, every diplomatic correspondence. And you will grant this not because you want to, but because you owe it to me, and because it is the only way to save what is left of this crown." Lucien looked at his wife, and Celine, watching from no great distance, from the memory that lived inside Lucien like a wound that would never fully scar, would have recognized what she saw on his face. Not the strategist, not the predator, the man. The man who had finally run out of moves, who had finally been forced to stand still and look at the wreckage without the comfort of a plan, and who had discovered in the wreckage something he had overlooked for years. A woman worth listening to. A partner worth respecting, a queen worth following. He nodded. "Then sit with me," Evelina said. She gestured to the chair across from hers. The chess set was between them. The fire was warm. The tower was quiet. Lucien sat. Evelina moved a pawn. They played. 5 years passed. The empire remembered the winter banquet the way empires remember near catastrophes, as a story, simplified and burnished by time, in which the villains were obvious and the heroes were clear and the lesson was clean. Duke Crestfall became a cautionary tale told at military academies and political dinners. The assassination became a footnote. The scandal became a whisper that lost its edges with each retelling until it was more legend than history. Queen Evelina Ashford became something the empire had not seen in generations. She became a sovereign, not a consort, not a figurehead. A ruler who governed with a precision and a clarity that made the court rethink everything it had assumed about the woman from the northern provinces. She reformed the council. She restructured the grain distribution system that Crestfall had tried to weaponize. She opened diplomatic channels with kingdoms that Lucien's aggressive posture had alienated. And she did it without spectacle, without drama, without the kind of performative authority that men in power often confuse with strength. She did it quietly, methodically, the way a woman who has survived a cold tower learns to build fire, one piece of wood at a time. Lucien governed beside her. He was not the same man. The crown sat differently on his head, heavier, more aware of its own weight. He made fewer unilateral decisions. He consulted Evelina on matters he would once have handled alone. He was not reformed. Celine would not have called him reformed. He was altered. The way a landscape is altered by fire. The bones are the same, the surface is new, and in the quiet hours, in the study by the fire, he sometimes sat in the chair where Celine used to sit, and he did not drink, and he did not plan, and he did not calculate. He just sat. And the sitting, the willingness to be still and feel the absence without trying to fill it, was the closest thing to growth that a man like Lucien Draven was capable of. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. But it was the thing he had. and he held it the way a man holds a stone he picked up from a road he will never walk again. Not because the stone is valuable, but because the road was everything. In the northern province, in a town at the edge of the border where the mountains met the plains, Celine Vale built a life. She reopened the healer's practice. She treated soldiers and farmers and children and old women with aching joints and young men with broken hearts, and she did it with the steady hands and clear eyes of a woman who has been through fire and come out the other side and discovered that the other side is not paradise, but it is solid and it is real, and it is hers. She lived alone. She did not seek love. She did not avoid it. She simply let it be what it would be, a question rather than an answer, a possibility rather than a requirement. She kept a garden behind the healer's house, a small plot where she grew chamomile and lavender, and a bitter herb whose name she never shared with anyone, and she tended it in the early mornings before the town woke up, kneeling in the dirt with her hands in the soil. And the scar below her left collarbone pulled with each movement, a reminder that she had been opened and stitched back together and that the stitching held. She kept Evelina's letter in a wooden box beside her bed. She read it sometimes. Not often. Just on the nights when the dark in her chest, which had never fully gone away but had shrunk to something manageable, something she could carry without being carried by it, pulsed a little larger, a little more insistent. On those nights she read the letter and she held the contradiction, the hurt and the tenderness, the betrayal and the grace, and she did not try to resolve it because she had learned that some things are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be held. The way you hold a scar, the way you hold a name, the way you hold the memory of a woman in a blue gown kneeling in blood and choosing, against all reason, to save the person who had given her every reason not to. She never went back to the palace. She never saw Lucien again. But once, in the 3rd year, a letter arrived at the healer's house. It bore no seal. It bore no signature. It was written in precise angular handwriting that Celine recognized immediately, and it contained a single line. The tower is warm now. Celine held the letter, and she stood at the window of the healer's house, and she looked out at the mountains, and she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was not a sad smile. It was the smile of a woman who has learned that the distance between two people can be vast and intimate at the same time, that you can love someone from 1,000 miles away with a love that is clean and quiet and asks for nothing, and that this kind of love, the kind that expects nothing and demands nothing and simply exists like a light left on in a window, is sometimes the strongest kind there is. She put the letter in the box with the other one. She went back to her garden. The sun came up over the mountains and the light was gold and cold and new, and the town below stirred and woke and began its day. And Celine Vale, former healer's apprentice, former chambermaid, former lover of a king, knelt in the dirt and tended her plants and breathed the clean air and let the morning hold her the way mornings do when you have finally stopped running and allowed yourself to be exactly where you are. The dark in her chest was quiet. The scar on her shoulder was warm. And the empire far to the south carried on the way empires do, grinding forward on the backs of ordinary people who loved and failed and hurt each other and tried again. And the story of the queen and the king and the woman between them faded into the kind of history that is told not in textbooks but in whispers, at kitchen tables, by firelight, by people who understand that the truest stories are the ones where nobody wins and nobody loses, and everybody is changed, irreversibly, permanently, into something they did not expect to become. And that is enough. That has to be enough.